Hi everyone, and welcome back to lesson 6 of my IELTS Writing Task 1 Masterclass. In this lesson, we're going to look at the structures that you can use to describe discrete data in a variety of ways. So if you recall from the previous lessons, we systematically categorize the different types of charts and the different types of data that you may be required to describe in IELTS Writing Task 1. There was interval data, which involved describing changes across time, things like increases, decreases, periods of fluctuation, peaks, low points, and the like. A second category of data that you may be asked to describe in IELTS is discrete information. And discrete data is not about describing changes, but rather describing a data set in a specific slice of time. Take a look at this sample bar chart that I have here displayed on the screen. As you can see, we are looking at the percentage of Canadians visiting different countries in 3 years. Yes, we do have years here. We do have different years, but we're not interested in saying whether the number of Canadian tourists increased or decreased, but rather we're trying to look at the data, the numbers, the figures across different categories. For example, sometimes you might want to describe the number of Canadian tourists in New Zealand to the number of Canadian tourists in the UK, the United States, Mexico, Italy, or Australia. You might want to talk about which country had the highest number of Canadian tourists or the lowest number of Canadian tourists. So as you can see, it is not about describing changes, but rather describing the state or the amounts at a specific point or across various categories. So let's begin by breaking down discrete data into the specific features that we might want to single out and describe in our body paragraphs. So we can begin by looking at the types of data that we might want to describe, right? That is in that discrete category, within that discrete category, basically. So one of the things you might want to describe if you are given a bar chart like this is the highest amounts, right? So highest and lowest amounts are very important to describe because remember, summarizing is a very important part of the writing process, and sometimes you can't describe everything in a category. So instead, you limit your descriptions only to things like the highest and the lowest amounts, which are emphatic. Another category that you might want to describe when it comes to discrete data is proportions. So by proportions, I mean describing things like one category is 1/3 of the total amount described. This is very useful in the case of pie charts, which also tend to describe discrete information. The third type of data you might want to describe is similarities. So this time, we've talked about the highest, the lowest, we've described some proportions, and sometimes we have two figures that are the same, and we might want to describe this. So we need to come up with useful structures for describing similar quantities. Finally, we also want to draw comparisons. So look at this bar chart. You can describe the highest, the lowest, proportions, similarities, but sometimes you just want to say that one category was greater in quantity compared to another category, or one specific group were lower in quantity compared to another group. So basically, when it comes to discrete data, these are the types of information that we might want to describe: highest and lowest amounts, proportions, similarities, and comparisons. Now, chances are that you already know how to describe these features, but if you don't know a range of structures for describing them, you may end up writing a paragraph that is repetitive and is recycling the same grammatical structure over and over again. So what I will do here is introduce a series of structures that will not only ensure that you write grammatically complete sentences, but also will incorporate a range and a variety of lexical and grammatical features into your writing. Let's begin with the structures for describing the highest and lowest amounts. So just add describing highest and lowest amounts. Okay, so there are two categories of structures which we can use for describing highest and lowest amounts. The first one we're going to call category first, and the second one we're going to call metric first. So we have category first structures and metric first structures. Let's start with the category first structure, and it looks something like this. We begin this structure with the category, and by category I mean which of these elements are we describing. For example, in this bar chart, New Zealand is a category, UK is a category, the United States is a category, or sometimes the other element that is breaking down the data can be regarded as a category. The years 2003, 2006, and 2013 can also be regarded as categories, depending on what aspect of the data we are focusing on. So we begin with the category, and we follow it up with a verb phrase. Now, the verbs that we can use in this instance are recorded, registered, and saw. So far we have category plus a verb phrase, which you can use from among these verbs. There are also other verbs that you could include in there, but these are foolproof verbs, verbs that you cannot go wrong by using. Since we're talking about highest and lowest amounts, we want to use some kind of superlative adjective here to describe the highest and lowest. And the adjectives that you can use include largest, greatest, or the smallest. So far we have category, a verb, a superlative adjective. Now we want to add a quantifier like number, percentage, proportion, share, amount, or quantity. Of course, we need to mention the NP, that is what is being compared, and this is one way of describing the structure. Now, let me show you exactly how this can be used with an example. Let's use this structure to describe a low or a high point in the data. Let's start with the high point. So we want to see in one of these years, for instance, in the year 2006, which of these countries had the highest percentage of Canadian tourists. Okay, so as you can see, we're looking at the year 2006, and the highest point belongs to the United States. So let's try to write an example using this structure part by part. First of all, which category are we focusing on? It's the United States. I'm going to say the United States. Then I'm going to choose one of these verbs. I'm going to go with the first one, recorded. Then I need to mention one of these superlatives. Remember, because it's a superlative, you always need to use the before it, right? So it's the largest, the greatest, the smallest. So we have two options for the highest and one for the lowest. In this case, we're describing the highest. So let's go with the largest, right? So the United States recorded the largest. Now, are we dealing with numbers, percentages, proportions, shares, amount, or quantity? Well, it's not a number. It is a percentage or proportion, right? Share could also work, but amount and quantity are mostly for non-percentage figures, right? So let's just go with percentage of. Now we need to add the noun phrase. That is, what do those numbers represent? What is being compared? It is the percentage of Canadian tourists. So I'm just going to add Canadian tourists. Now, of course, we need to add the quantity and also the year. So the year was 2006. So I can either place this here at the end of my sentence, or I could alternatively begin my sentence with the year. So in 2006, the United States recorded the largest percentage of Canadian tourists. But what about the quantity? So the quantity is, above 30%, right? Over 30%. So I can add something like with. You need a preposition. With works very well. Over 30%. Okay, so as you can see, I placed both an adverb for the time and I also recorded the exact number. This is something that you're going to have to do when it comes to writing your body paragraphs. You need to include the actual number in there. Let's do another example before we move on. This time, let's go with the lowest, right? So for the year 2006, the lowest percentage of Canadian tourists visited New Zealand, right? So there it is. That's the smallest bar. If you compare the same color across the categories, that is the countries, you'll see that New Zealand has the smallest number. So once again, let's start with the base structure and then we'll add the adverbs at the end, okay? So one more time, what is the category? This time, it's New Zealand, right? So New Zealand, again, let's go with a verb. We used recorded last time. This time we can go with registered. So New Zealand registered the, remember, always use a definite article before the superlative adjective. And this time, we're not talking about the largest or the greatest. We're actually talking about the smallest. So we're going to say registered the smallest. Again, we can go with percentage. Last time we went with percentage. This time we want to go with something different. So let's go with share, because again, a percentage is a share. So with this registered the smallest share of what? What is the MP? The MP is the same. Remember, in a previous lesson, I taught you to identify the MP as part of the understanding process. And once you document and register what that MP is, then you'll know that you can safely use it across the various structures and your sentences. So again, it'll be Canadian tourists. Okay, and we want to mention both the number and the year. So we want to use a somewhat different structure. Last time, for the quantity, we went with a preposition, with, and then we documented the number, over 30%. This time, let's do it a little differently. We can insert the quantity parenthetically. So we can say with well under 5%. See, this is the 5% mark. This is well under it. So I'm just going to add with well under 5%. And I can add the year at the end in 2006. So this is the first structure, and I've given you two examples of how to use this structure to describe the highest and the lowest figures when it comes to discrete data. Now, another thing that you should remember is that in this structure, we used the adjectives largest, greatest, and smallest. And these superlative adjectives, they collocate with the nouns that come after them. So largest number, largest percentage, largest proportions, it all works. Or greatest number, greatest percentage, greatest proportion. Again, you can combine them in whichever way you want, and you will always get an appropriate collocation. But what if you want to use a different set of superlatives? Is that possible? Yes, it is. So I'm going to rewrite this structure. So again, category, verb phrase, and let's see if we can come up with something a little different this time. The verbs are the same, so recorded, registered, saw, and then for the adjectives, this time we're going to go with highest and lowest. So when you use highest and lowest, the nouns that go with these two adjectives are a little different. The nouns that you can use here include rate, ratio, level, percentage, proportion, and figure. And once again, we follow it up with an NP. So let's see if we can rewrite these sentences using this second structure. I'm not going to change much. I'm going to repeat everything, just use the different structure to show you how you can create lexical range in your writing. So once again, let's go with in 2006. See, I'm repeating this sentence, trying to use the same structure, just change the lexical items to create more variety. So in 2006, the United States, I'll go with the same verb, recorded, and this time, instead of the largest, I'm going to say the highest. And so what is a noun that we can go and use in this case? You can basically use any of them because they're all referring to indices. And so we could say the highest level of Canadian tourists with over 30%. So as you can see, the structure is pretty much the same. The only difference is that here we use largest percentage, and here we're using a different combination of adjective nouns, which is highest level. So largest percentage, highest level. But as you can see, the combinatorial effect that we have here allows you to use a very wide range of possible collocations, really boosting your grammatical and lexical range. Let's do the same thing this time for the one with the smallest number, right? So here we have smallest share. Let's see how we can recycle this structure and use a different adjective noun combination. I'll keep everything else the same. So New Zealand registered. Now this time, instead of saying the smallest share, I'm going to go with lowest. And we can go with any of these, really. The lowest, let's go with proportion of Canadian tourists, again, with well under 5%, and I'll add the year at the end, in 2006. So again, same sentence, just a different adjective noun combination. Okay, so we've now looked at the first structure, which is category first. If you recall, the second way or second structure that we could use to describe highest and lowest amounts was called the metric first structure. And let's see what the metric first structure looks like. Keep in mind that once again, we're describing the same thing. We're describing highest and lowest amounts. We're just using a different format and structural form here. So whereas in the category first structure, we started with the category, as the name suggests, this time we're starting with the metric. That is, we are starting with the highest, the lowest. In other words, the adjective which appeared in the middle of the category first structure now begins our sentence. And some of the adjectives that you can use here include the largest, the greatest, and the smallest. Okay, as you can imagine, we follow this up with the quantifier. And the quantifiers that go with the largest, greatest, and smallest include number, proportion, share, amount, quantity, percentage, and proportion. So far we have the largest, greatest, smallest, number, proportion, share, amount, quantity, percentage, or proportion. Now we need to add the MP, right? So of plus MP. And we need to follow this up with our verb phrase. And so the verbs that we can use in this particular instance include was recorded in, was registered in, or was seen in. Remember, these are not the only verbs that you can use. In fact, you can use any type of verb that is introduced by the topic itself. These are just a few examples that are likely to be easily reused across different topics. Finally, we add the category. Remember, this is the same category that appeared first in the previous structure and now appears at the end of the metric first structure. Okay, let's see how we can, again, rewrite these sentences using the metric first structure. So remember, previously we had in 2006, the United States recorded the largest percentage of Canadian tourists with over 30%. This time, we're going to say the largest, okay, I'll just go with the first adjective, followed by one of these nouns. Now, what are we dealing with? We're dealing with a percentage. So we'll go with the largest percentage of, okay? And then what do we have after that? We have the MP of Canadian tourists. The MP remains the same. Then I'm going to use one of these verbs. In this case, I'll just go with was recorded in. And then what is the country? The category appears at the end. The category was the United States. So I'm just say the United States. And finally, I'll add the quantity with over 30%. And if I want to keep things consistent, I'm just going to add the year to the beginning of our sentence. So as you can see, these are two sentences that are describing the same point in my data, but look at how different the structures are. I've tried to keep a lot of the lexical choices the same, just to help you wrap your head around how these two structures are structurally different or grammatically different. So in the first instance, we have in 2006, the United States recorded the largest percentage of Canadian tourists with over 30%. In the second instance, we have in 2006, the largest percentage of Canadian tourists was recorded in the United States with over 30%. Let's do the same thing. This time, for this second sentence that we have here. So again, look, we had New Zealand registered the smallest share of Canadian tourists with under 5%. This time, we're going to say the smallest share of Canadian tourists. Okay, what is the verb that we're going to go with? Was registered. That's a good one. In New Zealand, once again, we can put the number inside parentheses and add the year to the very end of our sentence. So once again, I'm putting these structures side by side to help you better understand how they should be used. And in fact, to make it a little bit easier, for the category first structure, I'm going to use a color highlighting scheme. So how about we highlight this category first structure in yellow, and the metric first structure, let's go ahead and highlight that in green. So as you can see, we have some sentences written in these two structures. This first one, in 2006, the United States recorded the largest percentage of Canadian tourists. What is the color that we're going to use? This is yellow. The second one that you can see here is green. It's metric first. This sentence right here, again, it is following the category first structure, so we'll highlight that in yellow. And the second one, we're going to highlight that in green. So there you go. These are two very useful structures for describing highest and lowest amounts in a chart that is describing discrete information. Okay, now that we've covered the highest and lowest numbers in a chart, let's move on to the second type of data that we might want to describe in a discrete chart. And in this case, we're going to look at proportions. So I'm going to teach you how to describe proportions. First, let's try to understand what we mean by proportions. So let's take a look at this sample bar chart. And as you can see here, we can do comparisons in a variety of ways. And one instance is to say that something is greater, but instead of just saying one category is greater, we want to talk about the same comparison in terms of proportions. For example, let me draw your attention to the number of Canadian tourists in the year 2013. So we're talking about these bars here to the far right of each country. Okay? Now, if you compare the number of Canadian tourists who visited the United Kingdom in the year 2013, that's this bar here, to the number of Canadian tourists who visited the United States, that is this bar here, and you compare the numbers, you'll see that in the UK, the number was around 15%. So 15% of Canadian tourists visited the United Kingdom, whereas almost 30% of Canadian tourists visited the United States. So if we want to do that comparison, we can kind of see that the number of Canadian tourists who visited the United States was double the number of tourists from Canada who decided to go to the United Kingdom. So when I say proportions, when I say I want to look at describing proportions, this is what I mean. And again, while bar charts do include proportions, as do tables and other types of charts that describe discrete data, this is particularly useful for pie charts, because when you're dealing with a pie chart, proportions is basically all there is. It's basically looking at percentages and proportions. But we're still going to use this bar chart to review the structures and to come up with some sample sentences. Once again, when it comes to describing proportions, there are two structures that we can use, and these are the same categories as before. So we can describe proportions with the category first structure, or we can do so with the metric first structure. Let's start with the category first structure. Here's what the structure looks like for describing proportions using the category first format. So as the name suggests, we begin with the category, and then we follow it up with a verb phrase. Now, some useful verbs that you could use for describing this type of data include accounted for, constituted, made up, comprised, and represented. Notice that these verbs are stated in the past tense because in the majority of cases, you're dealing with data that's already been collected, and so you're describing it in the past tense. Next, we're going to describe proportions using fractions of some kind. Some examples include a fifth, a quarter, a third, half, or any other kind of fraction like 3/5. So far we have category, one of these verbs, followed by a fraction of some kind. Then we're going to add of the total. Now you could emphasize the fact that this is a percentage of the total. And finally you add number, rate, amount, or percentage of MP. Okay, so this is the category first structure that we're using. And I'm going to highlight this in yellow, just like we did for the previous structures. Let's try to put together a sample sentence here. So let's use the category first structure to describe a proportion that we see in this data. So first, let's familiarize ourselves with the chart. It says the pie charts below show the popularity of different sports among male and female athletes in a small Australian town. So we have percentage of male athletes who played different kinds of sports, and then percentage of female athletes who played the same sports. Now, can we find some kind of proportion? So 26% is a little over a quarter, right? So we have 100% total. 100% was the total number of male athletes who performed different kinds of sports. And of that total number, 26% were interested in basketball. So that is a quarter of the total. So let's try to use this information to come up with a sample sentence. So first of all, we need the category. So what is our category? The category is basketball. So I'm going to add basketball. Then I'm going to add one of these verbs here, right? I'll go with the first one, accounted for. Okay, and following this, I need to mention the specific proportion. In this case, it was a quarter. So basketball accounted for a quarter of the, now here, of the, I can add total, of the total, right? Now, I can add number, but to play it safe, I'm going to go with percentage, right? So a quarter of the total percentage of, now, what is the MP? The MP is male athletes. Remember, different sports among male and female athletes. That's the MP. So male athletes in Australia. Now, here you might say, well, it's not exactly a quarter, right? It is a little more than a quarter. It's 26% rather than 25%. So here I can use a word like approximately, right? So basketball accounted for approximately a quarter of the total percentage of male athletes in Australia. And I'm going to go ahead and highlight that in yellow to show that I'm following the category first structure. Let's do another one. This time we can look at cycling, which stood at 34%, and 34% is over a third, right? So it's more than a third. So if you want to follow the same structure, see how easy it is? So I'm going to say cycling, but for the verb, I'm going to be creative, right? I just want to show you that you don't necessarily have to use one of these verbs here. So what did cycling do? It attracted athletes, right? So I'm going to use that verb. I'm going to say cycling attracted over a third, right? So I used over to show that it is more than 33%, right? Which would be the third. And so a third, that is my proportion. And then I'm going to say of the total, right? So a third of the total, right? And then I can use something like rate of the total rate of Australian male athletes. Okay, so I hope that these two examples have shown you how you can use the category first structure to describe proportions for discrete charts. Now, I already mentioned that we also have another structure, which is called the metric first structure. And I'm going to follow my tradition of highlighting these structures and use the color green here. So metric first structure described in green. Let's first take a look at the structure together, and then after that we'll use this new structure to rewrite our examples from before. Okay, this time, because it's metric first, we start with the fraction. So, for instance, you can add your fraction here. For example, once again, a fifth, a quarter, a third, half, 3/5, and the like. And then you're going to say, once again, of the total, followed by the quantifier. So number, rate, amount, percentage of, followed by MP, and then we follow it up with our verb. So you see, for instance, a fraction of the total, number, rate, amount, percentage of MP. Obviously, we need to follow this up with a verb. And some of the verbs that you can use in this instance include was found in, was registered in or by, right? So it depends on the topic. And belonged to. And guess what? Whereas we started with the category in the category first structure, here we place the category at the very end. So let's see how these structures can be used to rewrite our samples from before. So previously, with the category first structure, we had basketball accounted for approximately a quarter of the total percentage of male athletes in Australia. This time, using the metric first structure, and again, I'll use the color green here, we are going to say something like this. We're going to say a fraction. So what was the fraction? It was a quarter, right? So I'm going to repeat that. I'm going to say a quarter of, remember, after quarter of, I can say of the total. So a quarter of the total. Last time we went with percentage of male athletes. I'm going to do the same. Percentage of male athletes in Australia. Now I'm going to use a verb here. right? A quarter of the total percentage of male athletes in Australia was found in, well, it's not really in, was registered in or belonged to. Well, definitely these verbs can be used, or I can be a little bit more creative and I can say a quarter of the total percentage of male athletes in Australia played, and then what is the category? The category is basketball. So I'm going to add basketball here to the end, right? Easy. Let's do the same thing this time for the second sentence. So we're taking this sentence that was written using the category first structure, and we're going to write it in the metric first format. Once again, what do we start with? We start with the fraction. So what is the fraction? It is a third of the total rate of Australian male athletes. I'm going to repeat that. So let's get the color coding right. And I'm going to say a third of the total, and it's over a third, right? So let's be consistent. Over a third of the total rate of Australian male athletes, right? Over a third of the total rate of Australian male athletes. Now, once again, we can use the same verb only in passive form. So we're attracted to cycling. Okay, so I hope these examples clearly show you how you can describe proportions in your data, something that is very common when it comes to bar charts, using two distinct sentence structures, namely the category first structure shown here in the color yellow and the metric first structure, which is shown here in the color green. And by mixing and matching these structures and using different noun forms, right, like different verbs, different category nouns, etc., you can create a lot of variety so that when the examiner reads your paragraph, they'll notice that you're using a variety of grammatical structures. And this can really help improve your score on the test day and can make you sound very natural in your writing. Okay, now that we've described the highest, the lowest, and the proportions in our data, let's turn our attention to describing similarities. So what do we mean by describing similarities? So whenever you're dealing with discrete data, sometimes it's important for you to describe two categories that are the same. For instance, if you look at the percentage of female athletes, you will see that the percentage who played table tennis was almost the same as those who were interested in swimming. So we have 10% for swimming and 11% for table tennis. So they're almost the same. What are some structures that we can use to describe this similarity? Once again, we have the category first structure and the metric first structure. So this is a pattern that I hope that you've picked up by now. Whenever you're writing, I want you to always be aware that the two ways of describing the data is category first or metric first. It doesn't matter if it's describing, highest points, lowest points, proportions, or similarities. These are the two main structural forms that you could benefit from. Once again, let's begin with the category first. And I'm going to use the same highlighting as before. We're going to highlight category first structures in yellow, and we'll use green to describe metric first structures and the examples that will follow. But remember, because we're comparing categories, we're going to have two, right? So we're comparing, for instance, table tennis to swimming. So we have two categories here. So I'm going to label these as categories A and category B. In the category first structure, we're going to begin with category A. We're going to follow this up with a verb such as accounted for, shared, or registered. Following this, we're going to include a noun that denotes similarity. Nouns such as the same, similar, or equal. Next, we're going to include quantifying nouns such as number, rate, amount, or percentage. We always need to include the MP, so we have of MP. And then we need to compare it to the second category. We're going to use as, that's the preposition, and then we add category B. Let's use this structure to come up with a sample sentence comparing table tennis and swimming in this pie chart here. So what is the first category? It's table tennis, right? So we're going to say table tennis. That's the category. Then we're going to follow it up with a verb. So let's go with accounted for. Then we're going to add one of these nouns, the same, similar, equal. So we're going to say table tennis accounted for the same. Okay, now we're dealing with percentages, so we're going to go with percentage of. Now, what is the noun? What is the MP here? It is female athletes, female Australian athletes, right? So female Australian athletes. And then we use as followed by category B. So as, what is the second category? It's swimming. So swimming is added here. Table tennis accounted for the same percentage of female Australian athletes as swimming. Let me highlight this in yellow just to show you that we're using the category first structure. And I still need to make a few tweaks to it. For instance, swimming is at 10%, table tennis is at 11%. So they're almost the same, right? So I'm going to add the word almost here to show that they are not exactly equal. And what about the quantities? How do I mention the numbers? I can add them parenthetically. So table tennis was 11%. I'm just going to add 11% here. And swimming was 10%. So 10% comes here. And there, this is how you can use the category first structure described here to compare two categories in this pie chart and to express the similarity of quantities. Now let's turn to the metric first structure and let's see how we can use this new structure to compare two similar percentages or amounts. So this time we begin with a word describing similarity. So this could be the same, similar, or equal. I'm using the capital letters because this is how we begin our sentence, right? Then we have number, rate, amount, percentage. We follow it up with of MP. Next, we need some kind of verb. And the verbs that you can use in the metric first structure include was recorded or was seen. Now we put both categories at the end. And the way we do this is we say in category A as in category B. Okay, let's see if we can use the metric first structure, which I'll highlight here in green, to rephrase this sentence that we wrote from before. So this time we begin with the same or similar or equal, right? I'm going to go with the same. Okay, so I'm going to say the same. Remember, it was almost the same. So we're going to repeat that I'm going to say almost the same. What comes after it, I'm going to add percentage of female Australian athletes. Remember, here we can begin with percentage of, the MP is female Australian athletes. So the same percentage of female Australian athletes, right? Now what do we need? We need this kind of verb, right? So the same percentage, almost the same percentage of female Australian athletes was interested in, now, category A. What is category A? It's table tennis. We're interested in table tennis. Then what comes in? We use as in, or just as simply. Category B is swimming. There. And once again, you can add the percentages in brackets. That's 11% for table tennis, and for swimming, it is 10%. So there you go. We just used both the category first and the metric first structure for comparing two categories that had similar quantities in our discrete chart. Finally, we want to look at the structure we can use to compare amounts. This is when you want to say that one category had a higher percentage or higher number compared to another category. It's not the highest or the lowest, but just relatively greater than another category that we're comparing it to. So for instance, an easy example here would be looking at this pie chart and saying that, for example, more female athletes were interested in basketball than chess, for instance. 27% is greater than 21%. So very flexible structure that could be used whenever one quantity is greater than another. So we're basically making comparisons. Okay, we're looking at structures that we could use to make comparisons as far as discrete data is concerned. And we only have one structure. So far we've had, category first and metric first. This time we only have one structure. It's very easy to learn. Bear with me. Because there is a comparison, obviously there's, again, category A and category B. So how do we put these together? We begin with one of the categories. So category A. Next, we follow it up with a verb phrase. And some of the verbs that you could use here are had, accounted for, registered, recorded, or again, any verb that makes sense given the data that you are given. Next, you're going to use a comparative adjective such as a greater, a larger, or a smaller. You need a quantifier, just like before, such as number, percentage, amount, share, quantity, or proportion. Just like before, you need to include your MP, so you're going to use of MP. Now, the word that we're going to use for the comparison is then, and we finally place category B at the end. Okay? So this is basically the structure that we're using. Let me show you how it's used with an example. So remember, we want to say that basketball was more popular than chess among female Australian athletes. So let's begin with the first category. So basketball. Now we could say accounted for, we could go with registered, right? Recorded, had. Let's just go with registered in this case. Or a verb like attracted would have worked really well here. Basketball attracted a greater percentage of female athletes. But then I'll just go with something included in the structure for now. So basketball registered a larger percentage, I could have gone with proportion, of female Australian athletes. This is the noun phrase. Female Australian athletes. Then I'm going to use the word for comparison. Then, and guess what? The second category could be anything that is smaller than basketball. So it could have been table tennis, chess, cycling, because they're all smaller than 27%. But this time, I'm just going to go with chess, right? There. What about the percentages? So again, I can add these parenthetically. I can say basketball, 27%, registered a larger percentage of Australian athletes than chess, and then I'll go with 21%. Let's do another example, this time from this pie chart belonging to male athletes. So let's do the opposite. Let's say one is smaller, right? And let's do something that was like very great in difference. So chess, only 2%. And then the highest is cycling, 34%, right? So we'll begin with the first category. We'll say chess, 2%, okay? I'm going to go with the verb attracted that I mentioned before. Now, I want to mention that the difference was great. So instead of saying a smaller, I'm going to say a significantly smaller, right? And so by adding the adverb significantly, I'm drawing my reader's attention to how big a difference there was between these two sports. So a significantly smaller percentage, this time, I used percentage before. I'm going to use proportion of male Australian athletes. Then, and what was it I was looking at? Cycling. And cycling was 34%. Now you might say, oh, this is quite random that you're comparing. See, I'm using it randomly, but when it comes to writing your own paragraphs, you're going to very carefully curate these. You're going to say, okay, it's important for me to compare these two amounts because of the way I'm presenting my data. So there you go. That is the structure that you can use to describe comparisons, make comparisons in discrete data. And that sums up the structures that you need to be using to describe discrete charts in IELTS Writing Task 1. So to go over it very quickly, in this lesson, we looked at describing discrete data, and we focused on introducing structures for describing highest and lowest amounts, proportions, similarities, and comparisons. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. I'll be back with the third part, which is the final segment of IELTS Writing Task 1 course, and we'll be writing sample responses together. So basically, now that we've learned how to understand our data, how to select and summarize, how to paraphrase, and the various structures needed for writing, we're actually going to do some sample writing tasks together. So if you haven't already, please subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who may also benefit from these lessons. Getting ready for IELTS is a big task, and I hope that these video lessons will help you improve in your process of learning and to achieve the score that you need. I'll see you all in the next video.